Welcome, dear listeners. Tonight's mystery begins where the sea keeps its secrets. Beneath the creaking boards of Sablewind Pier, something is waiting in the dark, silent, patient, and deadly. When a chilling discovery turns a quiet coastal town into a nest of suspicion, Hercule Poirot arrives to examine what the tide tried to hide. Strange footprints in wet sand, a missing lantern, and a killer whose alibi is as slippery as the fog. Settle in, listen closely, and let the little grey cells guide you through the killer waiting under Sablewind Pier. Chapter 1. Fog over Sablewind. The sea had its own way of keeping time at Sablewind, not by clocks, not by bells, but by the tide, by the patient pull of water against wood, by the slow corrosion of iron, by the way fog rolled in like a curtain that knew exactly when to fall. The locals said the pier could smell a storm before the clouds had decided to form. They spoke of it with affection and suspicion, the way one speaks of an old relative who has seen too much. On that particular evening, the pier seemed to be holding its breath. Sablewind Pier stretched into the grey like a long skeletal finger. Its planks were darkened from years of salt and rain, its railings worn smooth by countless hands, lovers leaning into the wind, fishermen staring into the chop, children daring each other to run to the end at high tide. But tonight there were no children, only fog, a dense, muffling fog that swallowed the lantern posts one by one, turning each flame into a floating ember before it vanished. The town behind the pier faded into silhouettes, roof lines, chimneys, a faint square of light from the inn window. The world felt smaller, tighter, as though Sablewind had been folded into the palm of something unseen. At the far end of the pier stood a man named Edmund Glass. He was a pierman, caretaker, repairman, quiet authority. He knew every groan and creak of the structure. He could tell by the vibration under his boots where a plank would need replacing before it broke. He carried a lantern in one hand and a small tool satchel in the other, and he walked with the cautious confidence of someone who trusted wood more than people. He had not planned to go out tonight, but earlier, at the Lantern Inn, Mrs. Beryl Pike, the innkeeper with a voice like sandpaper, had told him that one of the pier lights near the midsection was flickering badly. "If it goes out," she'd said, "someone's going to step wrong in this fog and sue me before they even drown." Edmund had grunted in agreement, though they both knew no one sued in Sablewind unless they were new money or desperate. Now he moved slowly along the pier, lantern held low so its glow could lick the planks and expose nails, gaps, slick patches of algae. The sea breathed beneath him, an endless dark exhale. Somewhere out in the fog, a buoy clanged softly, like a warning whispered at a distance. He reached the midsection and stopped. The lantern post was there, but its flame was weak, fluttering as though it had grown frightened. Edmund sighed. "Of course." He set his satchel down, unlatched the lantern housing, and leaned in. The glass was damp with condensation. The wick was charred. He began to work, fingers moving from habit rather than thought. That was when he noticed the sound. Not the sea, not the buoy. Footsteps. Soft, measured footsteps behind him. Wood responding to weight. Edmund straightened slowly. In the fog, at the edge of the lantern's reach, a figure stood near the rail. Just a shape at first. A coat collar, a hat brim, the suggestion of someone looking down into the water rather than out toward the town. Edmund felt a ripple of irritation. "Piers closed?" he called. No response. "Oi," Edmund said, voice sharper. "Piers closed in fog like this. Dangerous." The figure moved slightly, enough for Edmund to see a gloved hand resting on the railing. The glove was dark. The sleeve was neat. This was no fisherman. Edmund took a step forward. "You hearing me?" The figure turned just a fraction. Edmund caught a glimpse. Pale cheek, the edge of a mouth that might have been smiling or might have simply been expressionless. Then the figure stepped sideways and vanished into the fog. Edmund swore under his breath. He moved quickly to the rail and peered into the grey, but fog was not like darkness. Darkness you could pierce with light. Fog swallowed light greedily, turning it into nothing. Edmund lifted his lantern higher, scanning. Nothing, only the soft slap of water under the beams. He felt a small chill crawl up his spine. People did not vanish on a pier unless they knew exactly where they were going. Edmund returned to the lantern post, hands less steady now. He replaced the wick, adjusted the housing, ensured the flame burned stronger. When he finished, he locked it shut and stood for a moment, listening. No footsteps, no voices, only the sea. He picked up his satchel and continued toward the end of the pier, telling himself the figure had simply walked past him, disappeared into fog, nothing more. Yet as he walked, he noticed something that made his throat tighten. A second lantern post, further along, was out completely. Edmund stopped. That lantern had been lit when he came out. He remembered it clearly. A soft glow, a marker in the fog. Now it was dark. He quickened his pace. The planks under his boots grew slicker, the air colder. The fog thickened toward the far end, where the pier widened slightly, an old platform where once a small band had played on summer nights. He reached the dark lantern post and raised his own lantern to inspect it. The housing was open. Not broken, open. Edmund stared, confused. Someone had unlatched it deliberately. He leaned closer. The wick was intact. The oil reservoir still had oil, yet the flame had been extinguished. The fog pressed in around him, dampening sound. Even the buoy seemed quieter now, distant and hesitant. Edmund's pulse began to thud. He turned slowly, scanning the pier behind him. The lights he had passed now looked farther away than they should. Their glow was faint, distorted by fog, as if the pier had stretched in his absence. "Hello," he called. His voice vanished almost immediately, swallowed. He swallowed hard and forced himself to breathe. He was not afraid of fog. He was a man of the pier. He was afraid of people in fog. He closed the lantern housing, relit the wick, and watched the flame rise. It burned steady, too steady, like something trying to pretend nothing was wrong. Then he heard it again, a sound beneath the pier, a soft splash, not the slap of waves, a splash like a boot shifting in shallow water, like someone stepping on wet sand. Edmund froze. The pier's underside was accessible only at low tide, and tonight the tide was not low. It was creeping in. He moved to the railing, lantern held out, and peered down. The beams beneath were dark, slick with salt. Water moved between them like black ribbon. The fog down there was thicker, pooled. He saw nothing, but he felt it. An awareness, the way one feels eyes on one's back. Then, from somewhere below, a faint metallic clink sounded, like a chain tapped against wood. Edmund's grip tightened around his lantern handle. "Who's down there?" he called. Silence. He hesitated only a moment, then began to hurry back toward the town. He told himself he was going to fetch help, going to report a trespasser, going to tell the constable. But the truth was simpler. He did not want to be alone on that pier. Halfway back, he nearly collided with someone. A man emerged from the fog so suddenly that Edmund staggered. The figure was shorter than Edmund expected, with a neat silhouette and a hat worn at a precise angle. The lantern light caught a moustache, magnificent, waxed, unmistakable. Even in Sablewind, where strangers were rare, there were some faces that carried their own introductions. "Hercule Poirot," Edmund blurted, more surprised than respectful. Poirot inclined his head. "Bonsoir," he said gently. "You are the caretaker of the pier, yes?" Edmund stared. "What are you doing out here, in this fog?" Poirot lifted a gloved hand, as if to indicate the fog itself. "I find," he said softly, "that fog encourages people to do what they would not do in daylight." Edmund swallowed. "Someone's out here." Poirot's eyes sharpened, but his face remained calm. "Tell me." Edmund hesitated, then spoke quickly, words tumbling out. He explained the flickering lantern, the figure at the rail, the extinguished light, the open housing, the sound beneath the pier. As he spoke, Poirot's expression remained politely attentive, but his eyes grew brighter, as though each detail fed a mechanism inside his mind. When Edmund finished, Poirot nodded. "And you heard a splash beneath," Poirot said. "Yes?" Poirot tilted his head. "And you smelled anything unusual? Oil, perhaps? Smoke? Spirits?" Edmund blinked. "No, just sea." Poirot nodded again. "Very well," he said quietly. "We will go together." Edmund stiffened. "Go where?" Poirot gestured toward the end of the pier. "Toward the truth," he replied. Edmund's throat tightened. "Sir, I don't think—" Poirot's voice remained gentle but firm. "Mon ami," he said, "when a lantern is extinguished intentionally, it is not because someone prefers darkness. It is because someone prefers not to be seen." They walked slowly toward the dark lantern post. Poirot's stride measured. His lantern held just high enough to reveal the planks. without scattering too much light into fog. At the extinguished post, Poirot crouched. He examined the latch, the hinge, the housing. His gloved finger traced the metal edge. "Recently handled," he murmured. He lifted the lantern housing lid. The wick was fresh. Poirot's eyes moved to the wooden rail beside it, where the fog's dampness had formed a thin sheen. There, barely visible, was a smudge. Not salt, not water, a dark streak like leather rubbed against wet wood. Poirot touched it lightly, then brought his glove closer to his nose. "Wax," he murmured. Edmund frowned. "Wax?" Poirot nodded. "A candle wax," he said softly. "Or perhaps the wax of a matchstick." He rose and moved to the railing again. "Now," Poirot said, "we look below." Edmund leaned beside him, lantern held out. The light struggled to penetrate the fog beneath. Poirot remained still, eyes scanning not for a body, too early for that, but for signs. "Listen," Poirot whispered. Edmund listened. At first only water, then, faint, unmistakable, another small sound beneath. A scrape of wood against wood, like someone shifting weight on a beam. Poirot's face did not change, but his voice lowered. "Someone is there," he said. Edmund's mouth went dry. Should we call?" Poirot lifted his hand. "Not yet," he said softly. "First we must understand why the lantern was extinguished." Poirot's eyes narrowed, focusing on one point beneath the pier, an area where the beams formed a darker pocket. Then he spoke, calm as a priest. "Whoever you are," Poirot called into the fog, "I advise you to come out. The tide is rising, and darkness is not your friend." Silence. Poirot did not move. He waited, and then, from beneath the pier, a shape shifted, just a little, not enough to reveal itself fully, but enough for Edmund to see a pale edge of something caught between beams. Not driftwood, not seaweed, cloth. Poirot's voice turned very quiet. "Ah," he murmured. "So?" Edmund's knees felt weak. "What is it?" Poirot looked at him, eyes steady. "It is the beginning," Poirot said softly. "The pier has been asked to keep a secret." A distant shout carried faintly from the town, someone calling Edmund's name, perhaps, or calling out about the fog. The sound was swallowed by mist before it could become comfort. Poirot straightened, lantern light catching on the slick wood. "We will fetch the inspector," Poirot said. Edmund nodded shakily, almost grateful for instruction. They turned back toward the town, but as they walked, Edmund glanced over his shoulder once more. The extinguished lantern now burned again, but the fog around it seemed thicker than before, as if the light had angered whatever waited underneath, and somewhere below the pier, silent, patient, and hidden, something remained in the dark. Chapter 2. The Body Beneath the Boards. By the time the inspector arrived, the fog had thickened into something almost solid. It pressed against the pier like a living thing, curling around posts and railings, muffling sound until even shouted orders arrived as whispers. Lanterns appeared and vanished within it, floating points of yellow light bobbing as men moved carefully along the planks. The sea beneath the pier had begun its slow rise, water slapping against the beams with increasing insistence. Hercule Poirot stood near the extinguished lantern post, his coat buttoned, his hat tilted precisely, as if he were attending a formal gathering rather than the edge of a crime scene. Inspector Caleb Rourke arrived with 2 constables, boots thudding heavily, breath steaming in the damp air. "Poirot," Rourke said, relief cutting through his gruff tone. "I was told you were already here." Poirot inclined his head politely. "By coincidence only, Inspector. Though coincidence, as you know, is merely logic we have not yet examined." Rourke glanced toward the railing. "Mr. Glass says you heard something beneath." Poirot gestured lightly. "Not heard, Inspector. Confirmed." Rourke frowned but nodded. "All right. Let's take a look." They approached the railing together. Edmund Glass stood a few steps back, pale and rigid, lantern clenched in his fist like a talisman. Below them, the sea moved restlessly, the fog lying thick over the dark space beneath the pier. "Careful," Edmund muttered. "Tide's coming in." Rourke leaned over cautiously, one hand gripping the rail. One of the constables shone a lantern downward, its beam slicing briefly through the fog. For a moment there was nothing, then the light caught something pale. A shape lodged between the beams, half in shadow, half in water. The constable inhaled sharply. "Sir?" Rourke's jaw tightened. "Lower the light!" The beam steadied. Now there was no mistaking it. A human form lay wedged beneath the pier, one arm caught awkwardly against a beam, the body tilted at an unnatural angle. Dark fabric clung to it, soaked and heavy. The face was partially visible, turned upward, eyes closed, features waxen and still. Silence fell on the pier. Even the sea seemed to pause. Poirot leaned forward slightly, careful not to disturb anything. His eyes moved not to the face first, but to the positioning of the body. He murmured. Rourke swallowed. "Dead." "Yes," Poirot said quietly. "And placed." Rourke glanced at him sharply. "Placed?" Poirot nodded. "Bodies that fall rarely choose such tidy arrangements." Rourke straightened. "We'll need to bring him up, carefully." The constables moved into action, one fetching ropes, another calling back toward the town for additional hands. The pier creaked under the sudden activity, lanterns bobbing as shadows leapt and shrank. Poirot stepped aside, watching. Edmund Glass stood frozen. "Did you know him?" Poirot asked gently. Edmund shook his head. "Never seen him before." Poirot nodded. "Yet someone did." Below, the tide lapped higher, water beginning to cover the lower half of the body. The constables worked quickly, looping a rope around the torso, easing it free from the beams with careful coordination. As the body shifted, something small slipped free and splashed into the water. Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Stop!" The constable paused. Poirot leaned over, peering into the dark water. His lantern beam caught a glint just before it sank. "Inspector," Poirot said calmly, "you will want that." Rourke followed his gaze. "What was it?" Poirot's voice remained measured. "Metal, possibly brass." Rourke cursed under his breath. "Too late now," Poirot nodded. "Not too late. The tide remembers." The body was lifted slowly, hauled up onto the pier, and laid gently on a canvas sheet. Water streamed from the clothing, pooling between the planks before dripping back into the sea below. Rourke crouched beside it. "Male?" he said. "Mid-40s, perhaps? Well-dressed?" Poirot knelt as well, keeping a respectful distance. The man wore a dark overcoat, heavy and expensive. Beneath it, a suit, tailored, conservative, not local. Poirot noted the shoes, polished leather, soles barely scuffed. "He did not walk far," Poirot murmured. Rourke looked up. "Meaning?" Poirot gestured lightly. "Sablewind Pier planks leave their mark quickly. These shoes are too clean for a man wandering in fog." Rourke grunted. "So he was brought here?" Poirot nodded. "Or met someone he trusted?" The inspector nodded slowly. "Search his pockets," Rourke ordered. A constable complied, carefully turning out the coat pockets. Inside they found a wallet, a folded handkerchief, and a small leather notebook. Rourke took the wallet, opening it. "Name's Arthur Bellamy," he read. "Address in Brackenton." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "Ah." Rourke glanced up. "You know it?" "A town with docks," Poirot said. "And debts." Rourke frowned. "Debts?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Most harbours have them." The constable handed over the notebook. Rourke flipped through it quickly. "Mostly numbers," he muttered. "Names, dates." Poirot leaned in slightly, eyes scanning, without touching. "Business," Poirot murmured, "and not the honest kind." Rourke snapped the notebook shut. "We'll take him to the mortuary." Poirot nodded. "And the pier?" Poirot asked gently. Rourke sighed. "Closed. I'll have a guard posted." Poirot gestured toward the extinguished lantern. "And this?" Rourke frowned. "Someone turned it off." Poirot nodded. "Yes, but not to cause an accident." Rourke's eyes narrowed. "You think it was deliberate?" Poirot smiled politely. "Inspector, when someone removes light, it is usually because they wish something else to remain unseen." Rourke straightened. "We'll question the town." Poirot inclined his head. "Yes, and the inn." Rourke paused. "The Lantern Inn?" Poirot nodded. "Lanterns are always interesting places when lanterns go dark elsewhere." And the Lantern Inn was warm in a way the pier was not. Its windows glowed amber against the fog. the light spilling out onto wet cobblestones like honey. Inside, the smell of salt, ale, and old wood wrapped around anyone who entered, a familiar comfort that felt almost indecent after what had been found. The murmur of conversation faltered as Poirot and Rourke entered. Mrs. Beryl Pike stood behind the bar, wiping a glass with a cloth that had seen better decades. Her eyes flicked toward the door, sharp and assessing. "Evening," Rourke said. Mrs. Pike's mouth tightened. "Inspector?" Poirot inclined his head politely. "Madame." Mrs. Pike eyed him. "You're the foreign gentleman." Poirot smiled. "Belgian," she sniffed. "Figures." Rourke leaned against the bar. "We found a body beneath the pier." A hush fell over the room. Mrs. Pike's hand stilled. "Dead?" "Yes." She closed her eyes briefly. "I knew something was wrong tonight." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "You knew?" She nodded slowly. "A man came in earlier. Not from around here." Poirot leaned slightly forward. "Tell us about him." "Quiet," she said. "Polite. Ordered tea, not ale. Sat near the window watching the pier." Poirot nodded. "At what time?" "Just after 8. Rourke frowned. "Anyone with him?" Mrs. Pike hesitated. "Not at first." Poirot waited. "Then another man arrived," she continued. "Older, local." Poirot's eyebrows rose. "Local?" "Yes," she said. "Didn't sit, spoke to him briefly, too quietly to hear." Rourke asked, "Name?" Mrs. Pike shook her head. "Didn't catch it, but I've seen him before." Poirot smiled faintly. "Where?" She gestured vaguely. "Around the pier, around the docks." Poirot nodded. "And then?" Poirot prompted. "The stranger paid and left," she said. "The local followed a few minutes later." Poirot glanced at Rourke. "The stranger?" Poirot said softly. "Did he carry anything?" Mrs. Pike frowned. "A small case, leather." Poirot's eyes brightened. "Like a ledger?" She nodded slowly. "Could be." Rourke exhaled. "That fits." Poirot turned back to Mrs. Pike. "And the lantern?" Poirot asked gently. "Did anyone mention it?" Mrs. Pike's eyes flicked away for a moment. "Someone complained it went out." Poirot tilted his head. "Who?" She hesitated. "A man who comes in some nights, keeps to himself." Poirot waited. "Name's Jonah Creel," she said finally. "Dock worker, quiet type." Rourke straightened. "We'll speak with him." Poirot nodded. "Yes, we must." Poirot turned back toward the door, the fog pressing against the glass, as if eager to listen. "One more thing," Poirot said softly. Mrs. Pike looked at him. "The stranger," Poirot said, "did he seem afraid?" Mrs. Pike thought, then shook her head. "No." Poirot smiled faintly. "Then he did not know he was walking into darkness," Poirot murmured. Outside, the fog swirled thicker, as though drawn by secrets moving within it. Lanterns along the street flickered in the damp air, their glow uncertain. Poirot paused on the threshold, looking back once more at the inn. "The killer," Poirot said quietly, "did not strike in rage. He waited." Rourke nodded grimly. "Under the pier?" Poirot adjusted his moustache. "And perhaps," he added softly, "in the town itself." Chapter 3. Footprints that shouldn't exist. Morning came to Sablewind reluctantly. The fog did not lift with sunrise. It thinned, peeled back in layers, revealing the pier plank by plank, beam by beam, as though the town itself were deciding how much truth it was willing to expose. The sea lay calmer now, its surface deceptively smooth, hiding the restless movements that had carried a man's last secret through the night. Hercule Poirot stood at the pier's edge, hands folded behind his back, eyes fixed not on the horizon, but on the ground beneath his feet. "The morning," he murmured softly, "is when lies are most uncomfortable." Inspector Caleb Rourke joined him, boots crunching lightly against damp wood. The pier had been closed since the discovery, a rope barrier strung across its entrance. Beyond it, constables stood guard, their presence more symbolic than necessary in a town where curiosity was cautious and rumor traveled faster than footsteps. "You wanted daylight," Rourke said. "You've got it." Poirot nodded. "Yes, at night everything is possible. In daylight, only what truly happened remains." He gestured toward the planks near the extinguished lantern post. "Here," Poirot said, "this is where we begin." The wood was darker than the rest of the pier, saturated with moisture. Sea mist clung to it, beading in small droplets. At first glance it looked undisturbed. Poirot crouched. "Inspector," he said gently, "you see nothing, yes?" Rourke frowned. "Looks clean enough." Poirot smiled faintly. "Exactly." He produced a small handkerchief and dabbed lightly at the planks. The cloth darkened immediately. "Wet," Poirot said. "But not evenly." Rourke leaned closer. "What are you getting at?" Poirot shifted slightly so the low morning light struck the wood at an angle. "There," Poirot said. Rourke's eyes narrowed. At first it was subtle, so faint it could easily be dismissed as grain in the wood, but once seen it could not be unseen. Shallow impressions running parallel, interrupted and resumed, like a sentence written hesitantly, footprints, or rather the suggestion of them. "These planks were wiped," Poirot said quietly. "But not well." Rourke's jaw tightened. "Someone tried to clean the pier?" "Yes," Poirot replied. "But only part of it." He rose and moved a few steps forward, then crouched again. Here the marks were clearer, an arc of pressure where a heel had dug in slightly. The wood compressed just enough to hold memory. "These," Poirot continued, "were made after midnight, when the fog was thickest, when the tide was rising." Rourke exhaled slowly. "How can you be sure?" Poirot tapped the edge of the plank with his cane. "Salt water," he said. "The tide had already begun to reach this height. The moisture pattern tells us the order of events." He straightened. "First, footsteps," Poirot said. "Then water, then an attempt to erase both." Rourke looked toward the end of the pier. "Meaning someone walked out here and came back?" Poirot nodded. "At least once." They continued slowly, Poirot guiding Rourke with small gestures rather than words. At intervals the footprints faded entirely, only to reappear several feet later. "Why do they disappear?" Rourke asked. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Because," he said, "they were never meant to be continuous." He stopped near the rail where the lantern had been extinguished. "Here," Poirot said. The walker stopped. He pointed. A deeper mark pressed into the wood near the rail, as though someone had stood still, shifting weight from one foot to the other. "A pause," Poirot murmured. "A conversation, perhaps." Rourke glanced over the rail. "With the victim." Poirot nodded. "And look here," Poirot added, moving slightly to the side. Near the lantern post, on the inner edge of the planks, a different set of impressions appeared. Shorter stride, lighter pressure. Rourke frowned. "Another person?" "Yes," Poirot said softly. "And these footprints are older." Rourke blinked. "Older?" Poirot nodded. "They were partially erased before the tide reached this point. That tells us someone came earlier, perhaps to prepare." Rourke ran a hand over his face. "So we have at least two people on the pier." "At least," Poirot agreed. They walked further toward the town, following the faint trail of marks. Near the midpoint of the pier, the footprints became muddled, overlapping smudges half erased. Impressions. Poirot stopped abruptly. "Ah," he murmured. "What?" Rourke asked. Poirot pointed downward. Here the marks told a different story. One set continued steadily, the other faltered, shorter steps, uneven pressure. "Fear," Poirot said softly, "or resistance?" Rourke's voice dropped. "A struggle?" Poirot shook his head. "No," he said, "a realization." He straightened slowly. "The victim did not expect violence here," Poirot said, but he realized, too late, that he was being led somewhere he did not wish to go. They reached the end of the pier where the wood widened slightly. Here the sea air was sharper, the fog thinner. The boards were darker still, damp with spray. Poirot knelt again. "The footprints stop here," Poirot said. Rourke scanned the area. He didn't walk back. "No," Poirot replied. "He went down." Rourke followed Poirot's gaze. To the edge where a narrow ladder descended beneath the pier, slick with algae and half hidden in shadow. Rourke cursed softly. "That ladder's barely used." Poirot nodded. "Which is why it was chosen." He examined the ladder carefully. On one rung, the wood bore a faint scrape. "Fresh." Poirot smiled faintly. "Leather," he murmured. Rourke exhaled. "So he was led down there." Poirot nodded. "And then," Poirot continued, "the killer returned." Rourke looked back along the pier. "But the footprints back are cleaner." "Yes," Poirot said, "because the killer took care." Poirot rose and gestured toward the town. "Now," he said, "we ask ourselves, who knew this pier well enough to choose this spot?" Rourke answered without hesitation. "Dock workers, fishermen." Poirot nodded. "Yes, but also anyone who wished to be unseen." Later that morning, Poirot and Rourke walked the narrow lanes near the docks. The fog thinned further here, revealing weathered warehouses and coiled ropes, the scent of fish and tar heavy in the air. They found Jonah Creel sitting on an overturned crate, mending a net with slow, deliberate movements. Creel was a broad-shouldered man with a face shaped by wind and work. He looked up as they approached, eyes guarded. "Inspector," he said flatly. Rourke nodded. "Jonah." Poirot inclined his head politely. "Monsieur." Creel's eyes flicked to Poirot. "You're the foreigner." Poirot smiled. "Belgian," Creel grunted. "Figures." Poirot crouched near the net, examining it with interest. "Good knots," Poirot said. "Careful hands." Creel shrugged. "Gets the job done." Poirot nodded. "You were at the Lantern Inn last night," Poirot said gently. Creel's hands paused for just a moment, then resumed. "Lots of people were," Creel said. Poirot smiled faintly. "Yes," he said. "But not all complained about the pier lantern." Creel's jaw tightened. "It was dark, dangerous." Poirot tilted his head. "And yet you did not go to check it yourself." Creel looked up sharply. "That's not my job." Poirot nodded. "Tell me," Poirot said softly, "did you see Arthur Bellamy last night?" Creel hesitated. "Didn't know his name." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "But you knew his face?" Poirot said. Creel sighed. "Yes." Rourke crossed his arms. "Where did you see him?" Creel looked away toward the water. "At the inn." Poirot waited. "He asked questions," Creel continued. "About debts, about payments." Poirot nodded. "Yours?" Creel's lips thinned. "Among others." Poirot's voice remained gentle. "And you walked with him to the pier?" Creel swallowed. "Just to talk." Poirot smiled faintly. "And talk led to the ladder." Creel's shoulders tensed. "I didn't kill him," Creel said quickly. Poirot nodded. "Perhaps not." Creel looked up sharply. "Perhaps?" Poirot straightened. "But someone followed you," Poirot said. "Someone who extinguished the lantern, someone who preferred darkness." Creel's eyes widened slightly. "You heard footsteps behind you," Poirot said softly. Creel hesitated. "Yes," he admitted. Poirot nodded. "And you went down the ladder anyway." Creel's voice was low. "He said it would be private." Poirot's eyes softened, but only slightly. "Privacy," Poirot said. "Often a dangerous promise." Poirot turned back toward the pier in the distance, its silhouette stark against the clearing sky. "The footprints tell us much," Poirot said quietly. "They tell us who walked, they tell us who followed, and they tell us who returned alone." Rourke nodded grimly. Poirot adjusted his moustache. "And now," Poirot said, "we find who waited under the pier." Chapter 4. The Lantern That Vanished. By late morning, Sablewind had begun to resemble itself again. The fog retreated in tatters, exposing slate rooftops, narrow alleys, and the long spine of the pier stretching into open water. Fishermen resumed their routines with exaggerated normalcy, mending nets and unloading crates, as though a man had not been pulled from beneath the boards only hours earlier. In small towns, life learned to keep moving, not because it was brave, but because stopping was unbearable. Hercule Poirot watched all of this from a bench near the harbor wall. "The town breathes again," he murmured, "but it exhales lies." Inspector Caleb Rourke joined him, carrying a folded report and a cup of bitter coffee. "We've identified the lantern," Rourke said. "The one that went out." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Ah," Rourke continued. "Old brass model, fixed point, serviced weekly, no defect. Wick was sound." Poirot nodded. "So it did not fail?" "No," Rourke agreed. "It was extinguished." Poirot rose. "Then the lantern becomes our witness." They walked back toward the pier together. The rope barrier remained, though townsfolk lingered nearby under the pretense of idle curiosity. Poirot felt their eyes on his back, measuring the foreign detective who had arrived with the fog and now walked calmly through its aftermath. At the extinguished lantern post, Poirot crouched once more. "Inspector," Poirot said gently, "who maintains these lanterns?" Rourke gestured toward a small shed near the shore. "Pier authority. Edmund Glass, mostly. Occasionally Jonah Creel assists." Poirot nodded. "And who carries matches?" Poirot asked. Rourke frowned. "Anyone, I suppose." Poirot smiled faintly. "Matches are not all the same," he said. "Some burn cleanly, others leave wax." Rourke blinked. "Wax?" Poirot pointed to the inner rim of the lantern housing. In daylight, the residue was easier to see, a thin, cloudy smear near the latch. "See?" Poirot said. "Not soot, not oil. Wax." Rourke crouched. "From a candle," Poirot nodded. "Or a wax-coated matchstick." Rourke straightened slowly. "Not standard issue for pier maintenance." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "No, but quite common in certain homes." They walked away from the pier toward the cluster of houses nearest the shore. Old stone cottages with small windows and low doors, built to endure wind rather than welcome light. Poirot stopped before one of them. "This one," he said quietly. Rourke frowned. "How do you know?" Poirot smiled politely. "Because," he said, "from here you can see the lantern post clearly, but only when the lantern is lit." Rourke glanced toward the pier. "Someone stood here," Poirot continued, "and noticed when the light went out, or perhaps ensured that it did." They knocked. After a moment, the door opened to reveal Mrs. Elspeth Crowe, a widow known in Sablewind for her silence and her candles. She held one now, unlit, its wax thick and white. Her eyes flicked from Poirot to Rourke. "Inspector," she said flatly. Poirot inclined his head. "Madame," Rourke cleared his throat, "we're asking a few questions." She stepped aside without comment. Inside, the cottage smelled faintly of salt and wax. Candles lined the mantelpiece, arranged with almost religious care. Poirot's eyes moved over them appreciatively. "You prefer candles," Poirot said. She shrugged. "Electricity flickers." Poirot smiled. "Yes, lanterns do too, when encouraged." Her gaze sharpened. Poirot continued gently. "Did you notice the lantern on the pier last night?" She hesitated. "I noticed it was out." Poirot nodded. "At what time?" She frowned. "Late, near midnight." Poirot tilted his head. "And did you notice who was beneath it?" Her lips pressed together. "No." Poirot leaned slightly closer. "Madame," he said softly, "wax remembers fingers." She stiffened. Poirot gestured lightly toward her candle. "This wax," he said, "matches the residue on the lantern latch." Silence fell. Between them, Rourke shifted his weight. Mrs. Crowe exhaled slowly. "I didn't kill anyone." Poirot nodded. "I do not say you did." She looked at him sharply. "Then why am I here?" Poirot's voice remained calm. "Because," he said, "you helped create darkness." She turned away. "I was asked." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "By whom?" She hesitated. Rourke's tone hardened. "Mrs. Crowe," she sighed. "Jonah Creel." Poirot nodded slowly. "He asked you to extinguish the lantern." "Yes," she whispered. "He said it was for privacy, that someone didn't want to be seen." Poirot nodded. "And did you see anyone else?" Poirot asked. She swallowed. "A second man. Not Jonah." He waited. Poirot's gaze fixed on her. "Where?" "Under the pier stairs," she said softly, "in the shadow." Poirot nodded once. "Thank you, madame," he said gently. They left the cottage in silence. Outside, the sea glittered faintly, innocent and indifferent. Rourke broke the silence. "So Creel set the stage?" Poirot nodded. "Yes, but he was not the one waiting beneath." Rourke frowned. "Then who?" Poirot turned back toward the pier, where sunlight now struck the beams beneath, exposing dark shapes, old ropes, seaweed. and places where a man could stand unseen. The lantern, Poirot said softly, did not vanish by accident. It vanished so that someone could descend unseen and someone else could wait unseen. Rourke's jaw tightened. You're saying this was planned? Poirot smiled faintly. Inspector, he said, the sea may be chaotic, but murder prefers order. He adjusted his moustache. And now, Poirot continued, we ask the most important question of all. Rourke looked at him. Which is? Poirot's eyes were steady. Who benefits, he said, from a man dying under Sablewind Pier? The answer, Poirot knew, would not be found in fog or wax or footprints alone, but in money, fear, and the quiet agreements people believed the sea would keep for them. And somewhere in Sablewind, the person who had waited beneath the pier was beginning to realize that light, once restored, was very difficult to extinguish again. Chapter 5. A Debt Paid in Silence. Sablewind kept its secrets the way it kept its boats, tied down with rope and habit, anchored by generations who believed that nothing good came from speaking too loudly. By midday, the body had been moved to the small mortuary behind the constable's office. The pier remained closed. The Lantern Inn served stew and normal conversation to those who insisted on pretending the sea had not delivered a dead man like a message. But Poirot did not pretend. He sat at a corner table inside the Lantern Inn, his back to the wall, his tea untouched. Across from him, Inspector Caleb Rourke spread out papers and notes like a man preparing to wrestle something he could not quite see. You're convinced this is about money, Rourke said. Poirot smiled faintly. Inspector, most murders begin with emotion, fear, anger, jealousy, but they continue because of money. Money gives fear a plan. Rourke grunted. Arthur Bellamy, victim, came from Brackenton, dock business. Shipping clerks say he handled accounts. Poirot nodded. Accounts often kill more people than knives. Rourke slid the notebook across the table. We copied the pages, names, numbers, dates. Doesn't mean much to me. Poirot opened the notebook carefully, as though it might bite him. The handwriting inside was neat, impatient, and purposeful. Columns of figures, half-coded initials, and short phrases that seemed harmless, until one noticed how often the same words appeared. Paid, Sablewind, Pier, Night, Creel, Agreed, Crow, Wax, Harbour Share, Owed, Underboards, Safe. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Ah, he murmured. Rourke leaned forward. You see something? Poirot nodded. This notebook is not a record of honest business, Poirot said softly. It is a record of payments made for silence. Rourke frowned. You mean hush money? Poirot tilted his head. Hush money is too simple, Poirot said. This is a system. Rourke exhaled, rubbing his forehead. Sablewind's not big enough for systems. Poirot smiled faintly. Inspector, he said gently, small towns are perfect for systems. Everyone knows each other, and shame is more effective than law. Rourke stared at the notebook. Poirot continued reading. His little grey cells beginning to place people into patterns. Several names appeared repeatedly, Jonah Creel, Elspeth Crow, and a third initial that returned like a shadow, M.H. Poirot tapped the initials lightly. M.H., he murmured. Who is M.H.? Rourke frowned. Could be anyone, Poirot nodded, but likely someone important, someone who does not wish their full name written. Rourke leaned back. We questioned Creel again. He admits asking Crow to extinguish the lantern. Poirot nodded. Yes, stage 1. Rourke continued. He says Bellamy wanted privacy to talk about debts. Poirot's eyes remained calm. Stage 2. Rourke exhaled. But Creel insists he didn't kill Bellamy. Says he left after arguing. Poirot nodded. Perhaps he did. Rourke frowned. You believe him? Poirot smiled politely. I believe, Poirot said softly, that he tells a lie that sounds like truth. Rourke grunted. And what's the truth? Poirot closed the notebook gently. The truth, Poirot said, is that Jonah Creel's debt was not only financial. Rourke stared at him. What else? Poirot's eyes flicked toward the inn's bar, where Mrs. Beryl Pike pretended not to watch them. Debt, Poirot said softly, is often shame. Later that afternoon, Poirot requested a private conversation with Mrs. Pike. She brought him into the small back room behind the kitchen, where sacks of flour and barrels of ale stood like silent witnesses. She folded her arms and stared at him with suspicion. "You want more gossip, monsieur?" she asked sharply. Poirot smiled gently. "Not gossip, madame." "Truth," she snorted. "Truth's expensive." Poirot nodded. "So I have learned." He gestured to a chair. She did not sit. Poirot spoke calmly. "Arthur Bellamy came here with a leather case," he said. "What was in it?" Mrs. Pike's eyes narrowed. "How should I know?" Poirot's gaze remained steady. "Because," Poirot said softly, "he opened it here." Her mouth tightened. Poirot continued. "You saw papers," he said gently. "Perhaps a ledger, perhaps deeds, perhaps a contract tied to Sablewind Pier." Mrs. Pike's silence was answer enough. Poirot leaned slightly forward. "Madam Pike," he said softly, "how is the pier owned?" Her eyes flickered. Poirot's tone remained mild. "Publicly, it is town-managed. Privately, such things are rarely that simple." Mrs. Pike hesitated, then exhaled. "There are shares," she muttered. "Old arrangement. A few families." Poirot nodded. "And Jonah Creel?" She looked away. "His father had a share. Jonah inherited debt instead." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Debt to whom?" She hesitated longer this time. Poirot waited patiently. Finally she whispered, "To Marlowe Hawthorne." Poirot's eyes brightened. "M.H.," he murmured. "Marlowe Hawthorne." Rourke, who had been waiting just outside, stepped in. "Hawthorne, the shipping man?" Mrs. Pike nodded reluctantly. "He owns half the harbour contracts, lending too." Poirot nodded slowly. "A man who turns money into control," he murmured. Mrs. Pike's voice grew sharp. "He keeps the town running." Poirot smiled gently. "Or keeps it dependent," she bristled. "You outsiders don't understand. Hawthorne pays when storms ruin boats. He fronts repairs. People owe him." Poirot's eyes softened slightly. "And when people owe him," Poirot said, "they become quiet." Mrs. Pike swallowed. "Bellamy came here to collect?" Rourke asked. Mrs. Pike shook her head. "No, he came to threaten." Poirot's eyebrows rose. "Threaten?" She nodded, voice low. "He said he had proof of underboard deals, payments made at night under the pier. He said he'd take it to London if Hawthorne didn't pay him." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "And Jonah Creel was involved," Mrs. Pike whispered. "Yes, Hawthorne used Creel. Creel did small jobs, quiet jobs." Rourke's jaw tightened. "Like meeting Bellamy on the pier." Mrs. Pike nodded miserably. Poirot stood slowly. "Madam," he said gently, "did you see Hawthorne last night?" Mrs. Pike's eyes widened slightly. "No." Poirot tilted his head. "Did anyone?" She hesitated, then whispered. "He was supposed to be at the harbour office." Poirot nodded. "Supposed," he murmured. "A useful word." As they left the inn, Poirot and Rourke walked along the harbour wall. The sea was calmer now, the sky brighter, but the town felt darker because now the shapes of power had emerged. Rourke's voice was grim. "So Hawthorne's our man." Poirot shook his head gently. "Hawthorne is a possibility," Poirot said, "but not yet the certainty." Rourke frowned. "He benefits, he controls debt, he has motive." Poirot nodded. "Yes, but motive is common, opportunity is selective, and the pier requires knowledge." He paused, gazing toward the pier's underside. "Someone waited under there," Poirot said softly. "Not a man who fears damp or cold, not a man who panics." Rourke nodded slowly. "A man used to harbour work." Poirot smiled faintly. "Or," he said, "a man used to hiding." They reached the harbour office building, an old structure with salt-stained windows and a faded sign. Inside, the air smelled of paper and tar. And behind the desk sat Marlowe Hawthorne. He was not large, but he was solid, built like someone who had once done physical work and now paid others to do it. His hair was grey at the temples, his eyes sharp and amused. He looked up as Poirot entered and smiled as though welcoming a customer. "Inspector," Hawthorne said to Rourke. "And you must be the famous Belgian." Poirot inclined his head politely. "Monsieur Hawthorne," Poirot said softly, "we have much to discuss." Hawthorne smiled wider. "About a dead man." Poirot's eyes remained calm. "About a debt," Poirot said, "paid in silence." Hawthorne leaned back, expression casual. "Sablewind full of debts." Poirot smiled faintly. "Yes," he said, "but only one debt required the lantern to go dark." Hawthorne's smile faltered, just slightly, Poirot noticed. And somewhere deep in Sablewind, the sea continued its patient work. Washing away footprints, yes, but never quite washing away truth. Chapter 6. The witness who saw too little, Marlowe Hawthorne, did not look like a murderer. He looked like what Sablewind respected most, a man who could make things happen, a man who could get a boat repaired after a storm, get a debt delayed, get a contract signed, get a family through winter. In small towns, power rarely arrived in polished shoes, it arrived in practical favors. And favors, Poirot knew, were the most binding chains of all. Hawthorne leaned back in his chair inside the harbour office, fingers steepled, expression relaxed. "You've come about Arthur Bellamy," he said smoothly. Poirot remained standing, his posture immaculate. Inspector Rourke hovered near the door, arms crossed, jaw tight. "We have come," Poirot said gently, "about many things, monsieur. Mr. Bellamy is only the most recent." Hawthorne smiled. Faintly, "Recent corpses get attention." Poirot nodded. "Yes, especially when they appear beneath piers." Hawthorne's eyes glittered with mild amusement. "Seaside accidents happen." Poirot's expression remained calm. "Accidents do not request lanterns to be extinguished." For a fraction of a second, Hawthorne's smile tightened. Then it returned, smooth and controlled. "You're implying someone asked for darkness," he said. Poirot nodded. "Yes." "And you think it was me?" Hawthorne replied, voice still casual. Poirot tilted his head. "Do you deny it?" Hawthorne shrugged. "I deny being foolish enough to leave evidence." Poirot smiled faintly. "Then you admit being clever enough to avoid it." Rourke's temper flashed. "Watch your mouth, Hawthorne." Hawthorne spread his hands. "Inspector, you've known me for years. If I wanted someone dead, would I choose the pier where the entire town can see lanterns go out?" Poirot's eyes sharpened. "An excellent question," Poirot murmured. He stepped closer to the desk. "Monsieur Hawthorne," Poirot said softly, "where were you last night between 11 and 1? Hawthorne's answer came too quickly. "In my office," he said. "Paperwork. You can ask my clerk." Poirot nodded. "We will." Hawthorne continued smoothly. "Bellamy came here earlier in the week. He demanded money. He threatened London. I refused. He left angry." Poirot's gaze remained steady. "And then he died?" Hawthorne shrugged. "Not my doing," Poirot smiled faintly. "I do not accuse," Poirot said. "I observe." He turned toward the window. From here one could see the pier in the distance, its shape cutting into the sea. "You control debts," Poirot said softly, almost conversationally. "You control shares. You control people." Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. "I keep this town afloat," Poirot nodded. "Yes, but sometimes a man who keeps things afloat also decides what should sink." Hawthorne's smile faded slightly. "Poetic." Poirot turned back. "Tell me," Poirot said gently, "who is afraid of you in Sablewind?" Hawthorne laughed softly. "Everyone's afraid of something. Storms, hunger, loss." Poirot nodded. "And you," Poirot said, "are a convenient face for those fears." Hawthorne stared at him. Poirot continued calmly. "You may not have killed Bellamy," Poirot said, "but someone wished the town to think you did." Hawthorne's expression hardened. "And why would anyone want that?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Because blaming the powerful is easy. The powerful can survive accusations." Rourke frowned. "You're saying Hawthorne might be a decoy?" Poirot nodded. Perhaps. Hawthorne's eyes flickered, interest now rather than amusement. Poirot leaned slightly forward. Inspector, Poirot said softly, we require a witness, someone who saw too little. They found the clerk just after noon. His name was Thomas Wren, a thin young man with ink-stained fingers and anxious eyes. He worked in the back room of the harbour office, surrounded by ledgers and shipping manifests, stacked like unstable towers. When Rourke asked where Hawthorne had been the previous night, Wren swallowed hard. He was here, Wren said quickly. Until about midnight. Poirot's eyes sharpened. About midnight, Wren nodded. Yes, he left briefly, said he needed air. Hawthorne's gaze snapped toward him. Thomas? Wren flinched. Poirot remained calm. And did he return? Poirot asked gently. Wren hesitated. Yes, a few minutes later. Poirot nodded slowly. A few minutes, Poirot murmured. The missing minutes are always the most interesting. Hawthorne's voice was cold now. Are we done? Poirot smiled politely. Not yet, he said. We go to the pier again. The tide was low enough in the afternoon to reveal the understructure of the pier more clearly. The beams formed a lattice of shadow and algae. Dark pockets existed where a man could crouch and remain unseen from above. Poirot walked along the shoreline beneath the pier, boots sinking slightly into wet sand, the smell of seaweed sharp in his nostrils. Rourke followed with two constables. Poirot stopped beneath the section where the lantern had gone out. He examined the sand. Footprints here would have been erased by the tide, yet traces remained in sheltered areas protected by beams. Poirot crouched and pointed. Here, he said softly. Rourke leaned in. Marks? Poirot nodded. Knee prints. Rourke frowned. Someone knelt down here. Poirot's eyes remained calm. Someone waited, Poirot said. He moved further inward, toward the darkest pocket beneath the pier stairs, the place Mrs. Crowe had described. There, against a beam, he found something small wedged in wet sand. He reached down carefully and lifted it, a brass cap, round, slightly dented. Poirot held it up to the light. The thing that fell from the body when it was moved, Poirot murmured. Rourke stared. What is it? Poirot turned it over. Inside, a faint engraving was visible, two letters intertwined. M.H. Rourke's jaw tightened. Hawthorne? Poirot's eyes narrowed. Perhaps, Poirot said softly, or perhaps planted. Rourke stared at him. Planted? Why would someone plant Hawthorne's initials? Poirot's voice was quiet. To make the town look in one direction while the killer walks in another. Rourke exhaled sharply. You think Hawthorne's being framed? Poirot nodded. Or partially framed. A man like Hawthorne has enemies, many, but the killer's patience suggests someone who understands staging. He straightened slowly. Inspector, Poirot said, we need the person who saw. Bellamy's last steps on land. Rourke frowned. Creel already talked. Poirot shook his head. Creel saw too much. He will shape truth to protect himself. Poirot gestured toward the pier entrance. We need someone who thinks they saw nothing. They found that person in a cottage near the dunes, tucked behind tall grass and wind-bent shrubs. Her name was Maisie Calder, and she was the type of person small towns overlooked because she did not demand attention. She was a seamstress, quiet, practical, observant. She had a habit of sitting near her window with needlework, watching the world not for entertainment but out of instinct. Poirot knocked. Maisie opened the door cautiously, eyes narrowing at the sight of uniformed men. Yes? Inspector Rourke introduced himself. We're asking questions about last night. Her face tightened. I already told the constable. I didn't see anything. Poirot smiled gently. Mademoiselle Calder, you did not see anything important, but you saw something. Her eyes flickered. Poirot continued softly. You sit by your window, he said. You sew. Your eyes move from cloth to pier and back. You see without meaning to. Maisie swallowed. People walk past, that's all. Poirot nodded. And last night, he asked. She hesitated. There was fog. Poirot smiled. Fog does not blind everyone equally. Maisie's lips pressed together. Poirot leaned slightly closer, voice gentle. "Did you see two men heading toward the pier?" Poirot asked, her breath caught. "No," she whispered. Poirot nodded. "Then perhaps you saw one." Her hands trembled slightly. "I saw a man in a dark coat," she admitted quietly. "Not Jonah, another." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "And where did he come from?" Poirot asked. Maisie hesitated, then whispered, "From the harbour office direction." Rourke stiffened. Poirot kept his tone calm. "Was he alone?" Poirot asked. Maisie swallowed. "No, another man followed, keeping distance." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "The follower," he said softly. "Did he walk like a dock worker?" Maisie shook her head. "No, too careful, like he didn't want his boots to splash." Poirot nodded. "And did you see his face?" Maisie hesitated. "Only when the lantern flickered. He looked well-dressed." Poirot smiled faintly. "Well-dressed," he murmured. "A man who belongs in offices, not under piers." Rourke's jaw tightened. "You're saying Hawthorne went to the pier?" Poirot raised a hand gently. "Not yet," Poirot said. "We are saying someone came from the direction of Hawthorne's office. That is different." Maisie's voice trembled. "I didn't think it mattered." Poirot's eyes softened. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, "in murder, everything matters, especially what people believe does not." As they left the cottage, Rourke exhaled sharply. "We have two men," Rourke said. "One from harbour office direction, one well-dressed." Poirot nodded. "And a lantern extinguished by request," Poirot added. Rourke's voice was grim. "So the well-dressed man waited under the pier." Poirot's eyes were steady. "Yes," he said softly, "and he wore something with initials meant to mislead." Poirot looked toward the sea, where the pier cast long shadows in the late afternoon. "The witness saw too little," Poirot murmured, "but enough." He adjusted his moustache. "Now," Poirot said calmly, "we find the letter that will wash ashore." Chapter 7. A letter washed ashore. The tide turned just after dusk. In Sablewind, people noticed such things without thinking about them. Nets were shifted, boats were secured with an extra knot, and children were called home a little earlier. The sea had moods, and tonight its mood was unsettled, retreating slowly, reluctantly, as though revealing something it would rather keep. Hercule Poirot stood on the shoreline below the dunes, his coat buttoned high, his shoes already dusted with sand. Inspector Caleb Rourke paced a few steps behind him, scanning the waterline where foam traced uneven white lines like half-erased chalk. "You said the sea would give us something," Rourke muttered. Poirot smiled faintly. "I said," Poirot corrected gently, "that the sea would return something. The sea does not create, it only moves." Rourke snorted. "Convenient philosophy." Poirot stopped suddenly and pointed with his cane. "There," he said softly. Caught between two dark rocks lay a pale shape, fluttering slightly with each breath of the tide. It was not seaweed, not cloth, paper. Rourke strode forward and crouched, lifting it carefully. The paper was damp, edges frayed, but intact enough to read. An envelope, its seal broken, its contents partly exposed. "Well, I'll be damned," Rourke murmured. Poirot knelt beside him. "Let us be respectful," Poirot said. "Paper has survived much to reach us." Rourke opened it carefully and slid out the contents. A folded letter. The ink had run slightly, but the words were still legible. Poirot leaned closer, eyes sharpening. Rourke read aloud, "You promised discretion. The arrangement under the pier ends tonight. I have evidence. I will not be paid to disappear. Meet me where the lantern goes dark." A.B. Silence followed. Rourke exhaled slowly. "Bellamy wrote this." Poirot nodded. "Yes. And you promised discretion," Rourke continued. "That could be Hawthorne." Poirot tilted his head. "Or someone who promised Hawthorne," Poirot said softly. Rourke frowned. "Meaning?" Poirot straightened, gazing toward the pier, now outlined in twilight. "Mr. Bellamy was a collector," Poirot said. "Not only of debts, but of leverage. He sold silence, and silence has many buyers." Rourke rubbed his jaw. "The letter says the arrangement ends tonight," Poirot nodded. Yes, Bellamy believed he was in control. Rourke folded the letter carefully. He asked to meet where the lantern goes dark. He knew it would. Poirot smiled faintly. Indeed, Poirot said, which tells us the lantern was part of the agreement, not merely an improvisation. They walked back toward the pier as the last of the light drained from the sky. Lanterns along the shore flickered on, one by one, obedient and untroubled. Rourke spoke quietly. Creel knew, Crow knew, Bellamy knew, Hawthorne likely knew. Poirot nodded. Yes, but knowledge is not guilt. Rourke glanced at him. You're still protecting Hawthorne. Poirot shook his head gently. I protect logic, he said. And logic says Hawthorne had no need to wait under the pier. Rourke frowned. Why not? Poirot stopped and turned. Because Hawthorne, Poirot said calmly, controls from above. He sends others into the dark. Rourke's eyes narrowed. So who went down there? Poirot's voice softened. A man who feared exposure more than debt, Poirot said. A man who needed Bellamy silent, not delayed. They reached the pier entrance, where a constable stood guard. Beyond him, the pier stretched empty and still, the extinguished lantern now burning again, innocent and false. Poirot stepped onto the planks. Inspector, he said quietly, let us reconstruct. Rourke followed. Poirot spoke as they walked. Bellamy arrives with evidence, Poirot said. He threatens, he requests payment. Rourke nodded. Hawthorne refuses, Poirot corrected gently. Hawthorne negotiates, Rourke frowned. Meaning? Meaning, Poirot said. Bellamy leaves the office believing he has leverage, but not victory. They reached the midpoint of the pier. Jonah Creel meets Bellamy at the inn, Poirot continued. Creel owes Hawthorne. Bellamy pressures Creel. Rourke nodded. Creel asks Crow to extinguish the lantern. Yes, Poirot said, because Bellamy demands privacy. They stopped near the ladder. Creel leads Bellamy down, Poirot said, to frighten him, to show him the limits of his power. Rourke swallowed. But then, Poirot raised a finger. Then, Poirot said softly, Creel leaves. Rourke stared at him. Leaves Bellamy alive? Yes, Poirot replied. And frightened. Rourke's voice dropped. That's when the second man arrives. Poirot nodded. A man who did not argue, Poirot said. A man who waited. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the soft creak of the pier. Rourke spoke carefully. The letter says you promised discretion. Who promised Bellamy silence? Poirot smiled faintly. A man who needed Bellamy's evidence destroyed, Poirot said. Not bought. Rourke's eyes widened slightly. Someone higher up, Poirot nodded. And someone. Poirot continued. Who wears good shoes? They walked back toward shore. Inspector, Poirot said gently. Tell me, who manages the harbor accounts? Rourke frowned. Clerks, mostly. Poirot tilted his head. And who audits them? Rourke stopped. The town treasurer, he said slowly. Poirot smiled faintly. Yes, he said. Monsieur Edwin March. Rourke swore softly. March? He's been in that post 20 years. Poirot nodded. And Bellamy's notebook contained entries marked M.H. We assumed Hawthorne. Rourke's eyes sharpened. But M.H. could be... Poirot inclined his head. March Harbour, Poirot said softly. Or March Handling. Rourke stared at him. You think the initials were misread? Poirot nodded. Because Hawthorne's name is useful to blame. Rourke ran a hand through his hair. March handles accounts. He'd know where money disappears. Poirot's voice remained calm. And he would know, Poirot said, that Bellamy's evidence would destroy not just debts, but the system. Rourke exhaled slowly. And he's well dressed? Poirot smiled faintly. And careful not to splash. Rourke looked back toward the pier, then toward the town hall silhouetted against the darkening sky. Why would he kill Bellamy himself? Rourke asked. Why not send someone? Poirot's expression grew serious. Because, Poirot said softly, Bellamy trusted him. They reached the edge of the pier. Poirot stopped. One thing remains, Poirot said quietly. Rourke looked at him. "What's that?" Poirot held up the letter. "This letter was washed ashore," Poirot said. "But the evidence Bellamy carried was not." Rourke frowned. "You think something's missing?" Poirot nodded. "The killer did not merely kill Bellamy," Poirot said. "He took something." Rourke's voice was grim. "And you think March has it?" Poirot adjusted his moustache. "Either he has it," Poirot said softly, "or he believes he destroyed it." He turned toward the town, where lights glimmered behind curtains and people pretended not to watch the pier. "Inspector," Poirot said calmly, "it is time to set a trap." Rourke's jaw tightened. "For March," Poirot smiled faintly. "For the killer," he said. Chapter 8. The alibi that moves like tide. That night, Sablewind felt like a town pretending to sleep. Lights were dimmed behind curtains, but silhouettes lingered where people thought they could watch unseen. The pier lanterns burned steadily now, too steadily, like soldiers ordered to stand at attention after a breach. The sea was calmer, yes, but calm seas could be more threatening than storms. They encouraged confidence. They encouraged careless steps. Hercule Poirot walked slowly along the cobbled street toward the town hall, his cane tapping softly in rhythm with his thoughts. "The alibi," he murmured, "is like the tide. It shifts, it covers, it reveals." Inspector Caleb Rourke joined him at the corner, coat collar raised against the damp air. "You want to speak to Edwin March tonight," Rourke said. Poirot nodded. "Before his story settles into habit," Rourke grunted. "He's the treasurer. People trust him." Poirot smiled faintly. "People trust the man who counts the money because they prefer not to count it themselves." They arrived at the town hall, a modest building with tall windows and a bell tower that had not rung in years. Inside, the corridors smelled of paper, ink, and old varnish. Their footsteps echoed too loudly, as if the building wanted to announce them. They found Edwin March in his office, bent over a ledger. He was a slim man with careful hair and a tidy moustache, not as extravagant as Poirot's, but maintained with similar devotion. He wore a waistcoat, even at this late hour, and his ink pen moved across the page with deliberate precision. He looked up as they entered and offered a polite smile. "Inspector Rourke, Monsieur Poirot," he said smoothly, "to what do I owe this surprise?" Poirot inclined his head. "To your time," Poirot said gently. March's smile remained. "It is always available for the town," Poirot nodded. "And for the harbor." March blinked slightly, then regained his calm. "Yes, of course." Rourke's tone was blunt. "Where were you last night between 11 and 1? March did not hesitate. "Here," he said. "I was finalizing quarterly accounts. The storm last week caused delays." Poirot smiled faintly. "A convenient storm," Poirot murmured. March's smile tightened. "Not convenient, annoying." Poirot stepped closer to the desk. "And you were alone?" Poirot asked gently. March nodded. "Yes." Poirot tilted his head. "No clerk, no messenger, no witness?" March's eyes flickered. "The building was locked. The constable can confirm." Rourke frowned. "We'll check." Poirot nodded. March's voice remained polite. "Is this about Arthur Bellamy?" Poirot's eyes sharpened. "You know his name?" Poirot said softly. March paused, a fraction too long. "The whole town knows it now," he replied smoothly. "Tragic business." Poirot smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "Indeed," Poirot said. "Tragic, especially when tragedy is arranged." March's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Poirot reached into his coat and withdrew the damp letter, now dried and preserved. "We found this washed ashore," Poirot said gently. "It was written by Arthur Bellamy." March glanced at it, expression neutral. "And?" Poirot placed it on the desk. March read the first line, then looked up quickly. Poirot watched carefully. "You promised discretion," Poirot read softly, his finger tapping the words. "Who promised him discretion, Monsieur March?" March's smile returned, smooth and practiced. "Not I," he said. "I never met Bellamy." Poirot nodded. "Never met him," Poirot repeated. "Yet you read his words with familiarity." March's brows drew together. "Familiarity? I read English, monsieur." Poirot smiled faintly. "Yes," he said. And you rid fear even better. March's jaw tightened. Poirot continued gently. Bellamy's notebook contained payments marked M.H., Poirot said. The town assumed Marlowe Hawthorne. March's expression remained controlled. Reasonable assumption. Poirot nodded. Yes, he said. Reasonable, too reasonable. Rourke leaned forward. We've found a brass cap under the pier with M.H. engraved. March's eyes widened slightly. Poirot observed the reaction with satisfaction. That would point to Hawthorne, March said carefully. Poirot nodded. It points, but it does not prove. March swallowed. Then why are you here? Poirot leaned slightly closer. Because, Poirot said softly, your alibi moves like tide water. It covers what it needs to cover, but it cannot cover everything. March's voice sharpened. My alibi is simple. I was here. Poirot nodded. And Hawthorne's clerk, Poirot added, says Hawthorne left his office briefly around midnight. March blinked. Poirot continued. The witness Maisie Calder saw a man walking toward the pier from the harbour office direction. Poirot said, well dressed, careful not to splash. March's mouth tightened. Poirot's voice remained calm. Monsieur March, Poirot said softly, you are well dressed, you are careful. You are the type of man who dislikes splashes. March's smile faded entirely. Rourke's tone hardened. Enough games. Did you go to the pier? March stood abruptly. This is outrageous. Poirot did not move. No, Poirot said quietly. Outrageous is killing a man and hiding him under boards. March's hands clenched. Poirot gestured calmly toward the ledger. May I? Poirot asked. March hesitated. Those are town accounts. Poirot nodded. Which belong to the town. March's face tightened, but he stepped aside reluctantly. Poirot examined the ledger. His eyes moved quickly, scanning entries. Many were ordinary, repairs, wages, supplies. But Poirot's gaze sharpened when he saw a particular entry, one that seemed too small to matter. Maintenance, pier lanterns, wax and wicks. Poirot tapped it gently. Wax, Poirot murmured. March's face paled slightly. Poirot looked up. You ordered wax, Poirot said softly. Not the pier caretaker. March swallowed. For emergency candles, storm preparations. Poirot smiled faintly. Yes, he said. And one candle helped the lantern vanish. March's voice shook. You have no proof Poirot raised a hand gently. Not yet, Poirot said. But we will. He closed the ledger carefully. Inspector, Poirot said calmly, we will set our trap tonight. Rourke's eyes narrowed. At the pier, Poirot nodded. Because, Poirot said softly, the killer believes the pier belongs to him. He believes the sea will erase his steps. March's voice was tight. This is madness. Poirot looked at him steadily. No, Poirot said. This is restoration. By nightfall, the pier was alive again, but quietly. Rourke positioned constables along the shoreline, hidden behind dunes and boats. One waited near the pier stairs. Another crouched beneath the pier's beams, watching the darkest pocket where a man could stand unseen. Poirot stood at the midpoint near the lantern post, alone in full view. He wanted the killer to see him. On the planks near Poirot's feet lay a small object, a leather case. It looked heavy, official, valuable. Inside it was nothing but paper scraps and a weight, but from a distance it could only be one thing, evidence. Poirot waited. The sea whispered beneath. Minutes passed, then the lantern flickered, once. Poirot's eyes sharpened. A shape moved at the far end of the pier, emerging from fog like a thought becoming real. A man in a dark coat, walking carefully. He paused near the ladder. Then he stepped down. Poirot's voice remained calm, almost conversational, as he spoke softly into the night. Inspector, Poirot murmured, our tide begins to shift. From the shadows, constables moved silently into position. Under the pier, the sea lapped against beams, and somewhere beneath the boards, a man approached the hiding place he believed was safe. Drawn by the promise that evidence could finally be destroyed, Poirot's moustache twitched. One step more, he whispered, and the sea will not protect you. Chapter 9. Poirot sets the trap. The pier did not creak when the man descended the ladder. That, Poirot noted, was the first mistake. Wood always spoke, if one knew how to listen. It sighed under careless weight, protested under panic, complained under haste. But this descent was measured, practiced. Each rung was tested before committing weight. Boots placed precisely where the algae thinned. Whoever climbed down had done so before. Poirot remained motionless near the lantern post, his silhouette clear against the light. From a distance he must have looked alone, an aging foreigner guarding a foolishly tempting prize. The leather case lay at his feet, the sea whispered. Below the pier, a shadow moved. Inspector Rourke watched from behind the dunes, breath held. His hand hovered near his whistle, but he did not raise it. Poirot had insisted, not yet. Timing, Poirot had said, was everything. Justice rushed, was often justice misdirected. Under the pier, Edwin March crouched. The damp crept into his knees through the thin wool of his trousers. But he did not shift. He had learned long ago that discomfort was preferable to exposure. He listened to the water, to the muffled echo of footsteps above. His eyes were fixed on the ladder. The case is there, he thought. He brought it. That infuriated him. Bellamy had been a nuisance, an accountant who believed that numbers gave him power over men who understood leverage better than ledgers. Bellamy had not understood Sablewind. He had not understood that some arrangements were older than paperwork, and now the Belgian stood where Bellamy once stood, dangling danger like bait. March waited. Above, Poirot shifted slightly, just enough for the lantern light to catch the edge of the leather case. From below it gleamed. March exhaled slowly. Now he moved. March rose from his crouch and stepped carefully toward the beam where the ladder met the understructure. He reached up, one gloved hand grasping the rung. At that moment, Poirot spoke. "Bonsoir, monsieur." March froze. The voice was calm, polite, almost friendly. March's hand tightened on the rung. Poirot continued gently. "You have learned," Poirot said, "that darkness is very useful. But you have forgotten one thing." March did not answer. Poirot's voice carried softly down through the beams. "Darkness," Poirot said, "belongs to those who believe they are alone." March's pulse thudded in his ears. Above, Poirot stepped closer to the ladder. "You came for the evidence," Poirot said conversationally, "just as you came for Bellamy." March's breath quickened. "You're wrong." Poirot smiled faintly. "No," Poirot said, "I am precise." March climbed one rung, then another. Slowly, cautiously, he emerged from beneath the pier, the lantern light revealing his face inch by inch. He looked smaller now, not weak, but diminished. The careful composure he wore in his office had cracked, revealing calculation beneath. Poirot regarded him calmly. "Monsieur March," Poirot said, "you should not have come yourself." March's mouth twisted. "You forced my hand." Poirot nodded. "Yes." March glanced toward the shadows along the shore. "You think you've won." Poirot tilted his head. "No, I think the truth has." March laughed softly, bitterly. "Truth doesn't keep towns alive." Poirot's eyes hardened. "No," Poirot said quietly, "but lies rot them." March straightened, attempting dignity. "Bellamy threatened to expose everything," March said. "He didn't care who suffered." Poirot nodded. "That is true." March's voice grew sharper. "If Hawthorne fell, the harbor would collapse, boats would rot, families would starve." Poirot studied him. "And so," Poirot said, "you decided one man should die." March clenched his fists. "I decided the town should live." Poirot shook his head gently. "No," Poirot said, "you decided you should remain untouchable." March scoffed. "You don't understand this place." Poirot stepped closer. "I understand it very well," Poirot said softly. "I understand that you hid behind Hawthorne's reputation. You planted his initials beneath the pier. You allowed Jonah Creel to believe he was the worst of his sins." March's jaw tightened. "And when Bellamy demanded payment," Poirot continued, "you saw an opportunity." March's voice dropped. "He trusted me." Poirot nodded. "Yes." March's shoulders sagged slightly. "I told him Creel would meet him. I told him the lantern would go dark. I told him it was safe." Poirot's eyes darkened. "And when Creel left him frightened beneath the pier," Poirot said, "you went down after him." March's lips trembled. I only meant to scare him, to make him destroy the evidence. Poirot's voice was steady. And when he refused, March closed his eyes. He laughed, March whispered. He said he'd already sent copies. Poirot exhaled slowly. So you struck him, Poirot said, not in rage, but in panic. March nodded once. He fell, March said, hit his head. Poirot's gaze did not waver. And you left him there, Poirot said softly, to let the sea finish what you began. March's voice broke. I didn't mean… Poirot raised a hand gently. Intent, Poirot said, does not change outcome. March sagged against the railing. I turned off the lantern, March whispered. I used the candle. I wiped the planks. I planted the cap. I thought the sea would erase everything. Poirot's voice was calm, almost sad. The sea erases, Poirot said, but it also returns. A sharp whistle cut through the night. Constables emerged from the shadows, lanterns raised, boots pounding against planks. Inspector Rourke stepped forward, face grim. Edwin March, Rourke said, you're under arrest for the murder of Arthur Bellamy. March did not resist. As they led him away, he looked once more at the pier. I kept the town alive, he muttered. Poirot watched him go. No, Poirot said quietly. You kept it afraid. The pier creaked softly, as though in agreement. Chapter 10, The Killer Waiting Under the Pier Dawn, returned to Sablewind quietly. It did not announce itself with color or brilliance. It arrived the way truth often did in small towns, slowly, carefully, as though aware it might not be entirely welcome. The sky lightened from charcoal to pewter, and the sea lay flat and pale, its surface untroubled by the night's confession. The pier stood unchanged, and yet everything had changed. Hercule Poirot stood at its entrance, hands folded behind his back, watching the tide retreat once more from beneath the boards. The lanterns still burned, but their glow was unnecessary now. Daylight had claimed its authority. Inspector Caleb Rourke approached, his steps heavy with fatigue rather than doubt. It's over, Rourke said. Poirot nodded gently. Yes, but the town will need time to believe it. Rourke glanced toward the constables escorting Edwin March toward the waiting carriage. March did not struggle. His posture was straight, his face composed, but something essential had drained from him. The careful man had been unmasked, and careful men rarely survive that intact. He confessed, Rourke said. Everything. Poirot inclined his head. Truth often rushes out once there is no place left to hide. Rourke hesitated. Hawthorne. He'll walk. Poirot nodded. Yes. Rourke grimaced. That won't sit well. Poirot smiled faintly. Justice and satisfaction are not the same thing, Inspector. They walked slowly along the pier, stopping at the lantern post that had become the story's pivot. Poirot rested his hand briefly on the metal housing. This lantern, Poirot said softly, was asked to lie. Rourke snorted. It did a good job. Poirot shook his head gently. No, he said. It failed at the most important moment. Rourke frowned. When? Poirot gestured toward the horizon. When daylight returned, Poirot said. They reached the midpoint where the ladder descended beneath the pier. The tide was low enough now that the beams were fully visible, slick with algae and shadowed by memory. Rourke stared down. He waited here, Rourke said quietly. Poirot nodded. Yes, Poirot said. Not the killer at first, but the fear. Rourke looked at him. Poirot continued calmly. Arthur Bellamy believed leverage would save him, Poirot said. Jonah Creel believed obedience would protect him. Mrs. Crowe believed silence would spare her. Hawthorne believed power would shield him. Rourke sighed. And March? Poirot's eyes softened slightly. March believed, Poirot said, that order justified cruelty. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the sea move beneath them, indifferent now, its work done. Rourke spoke again. Bellamy's evidence, what he carried, Poirot nodded. Destroyed, Rourke frowned. Then March succeeded. Poirot shook his head gently. No, he said. He failed. Rourke blinked. How? Poirot smiled faintly. Because Bellamy did not need his documents to expose the truth, Poirot said. The truth was already alive, in people, Rourke frowned. People are unreliable, Poirot nodded. Yes, but patterns are not. They turned back toward the shore, where townsfolk had begun to gather, not openly, not boldly, but close enough to see that something final had occurred. Whispers passed between them like cautious birds. At the Lantern Inn, Mrs. Beryl Pike stood in the doorway, arms folded, eyes fixed on the pier. When she saw Poirot, she straightened. "It's finished?" she asked. Poirot inclined his head. Yes." She exhaled slowly. "Good." Poirot studied her. "Madame," he said gently, "the pier will open again, but it will not forget." She nodded. "Neither will we." Poirot smiled faintly. Inside the inn, Jonah Creel sat alone at a table, hands clasped tightly around a mug he had not touched. When Poirot approached, Creel looked up, eyes hollow, ashamed. "They say it was March," Creel muttered. "I didn't know." Poirot nodded. "You knew enough," Creel swallowed. "I didn't mean for him to die." Poirot's gaze was calm. "No," Poirot said. "You meant for him to be afraid." Creel flinched. Poirot continued gently. "Fear," Poirot said, "is a weapon that does not choose its final victim." Creel stared at the table. "What happens now?" Poirot tilted his head. "Now," Poirot said, "you decide what kind of man you will be without debts to hide behind." Creel nodded slowly, as if accepting a sentence more frightening than prison. Outside, Maisie Calder stood near the dunes, her sewing basket at her feet, thread caught uselessly between her fingers. Poirot approached her. "You spoke when it mattered," Poirot said gently. She shrugged, embarrassed. "I didn't want trouble," Poirot smiled faintly. "And yet," Poirot said, "you prevented more." She looked up at the pier. "Will it ever feel the same?" Poirot considered the question carefully. "No," he said softly, "but that is not always a loss." As the morning advanced, the constables removed the ropes blocking the pier entrance. The town watched as the barrier fell away, not rushing forward, not celebrating, but acknowledging a return to something altered. Poirot stood once more at the lantern post, adjusting his gloves. Rourke joined him. "You're leaving?" Rourke said. Poirot nodded. "Yes, my work here is complete." Rourke hesitated. "You could stay. Sablewind could use a man like you." Poirot smiled kindly. "Sablewind," Poirot said, "needs to learn to trust daylight again." Rourke nodded. As Poirot walked away from the pier, he paused once, just once, and looked back beneath the boards where the shadows had thinned. The killer waited under the pier, Poirot murmured to himself. But he was not the only one. The sea waited too, patient, observant, ready to return what people believed it would hide. Poirot adjusted his moustache and continued down the road, leaving Sablewind behind, lighter by one secret, heavier by the knowledge of how close darkness had come, and behind him the pier stood silent, its boards dry now, its lanterns honest again, for as long as they could be. And so, dear listener, as the tide retreats and the lanterns burn honestly once more, we leave Sablewind behind, quiet, altered, and watchful. Beneath its weathered pier, fear once waited in the dark, believing secrecy could drown truth. But, as Hercule Poirot reminds us, the sea may erase footprints, yet it always returns what matters. If this mystery stirred your little grey cells, take a moment to reflect. At what point did you sense the truth beneath the boards? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let us know which classic-style detective story you'd like to explore next. Until our paths cross again, keep your eyes open, your mind sharper still, and remember, even the calmest waters can hide a crime.